The thoughts of Zelensky's latest visit or new plan to visit Washington is one of the most consequential diplomatic maneuvers in Ukraine's modern history, and his arrival, probably flanked by the French President Emmanuel Macron and the British Prime Minister Sir Keir Starmer, as rumours are suggesting, underscores Europe's growing anxiety over the shifts in US foreign policy under Donald Trump. And with the US having frozen all military aid to Ukraine, European allies are scrambling to secure assurances that Washington remains committed to resisting Russian expansion. The US decision to pause military assistance to Ukraine, coming in the wake of this tense public clash between Zelensky and Trump in the Oval Office, has sent shockwaves through Kyiv and its European backers, and the situation has reached a crisis point. Ukraine's air defense systems, particularly its Patriot missiles batteries, will soon run out of munitions, leaving major cities vulnerable to Russian air assault. And Trump's assertion that Ukraine is ready for negotiations with Russia suggests that military aid is now being wielded as a tool to coerce Zelensky into a peace deal on terms potentially favourable to the Kremlin. And the spectre of Minsk III looms large, with the Belarusian dictator Alexander Lukashenko offering to host trilateral negotiations between the US, Russia and Ukraine in Minsk, an idea that has been met with enthusiasm in Moscow but deep scepticism in Kyiv and I hope elsewhere. The potential presence of Macron and Starmer in Washington again signals European efforts to shore up diplomatic influence as the transatlantic alliance faces unprecedented strain. France and the UK, both significant contributors to military aid in Ukraine, find themselves in an awkward position too. While they have increased their own defence commitments, neither can replace the sheer scale of US military support. And their attendance would likely serve two purposes: to pressure Trump into unfreezing aid and to reinforce the argument that Ukraine's survival is a matter of European security. For Starmer, this visit represents a major diplomatic test. With his recent election as Prime Minister, with his recent trip to Washington, his presence alongside Zelensky would cement Britain's role as one of Ukraine's most steadfast allies. It would also cement Starmer's role as a serious contender on the world stage. Starmer has inherited a landscape where Britain's influence because of Brexit is waning, but this crisis represents an opportunity to reposition the UK as a crucial mediator between Washington and Kyiv. Trump's repeated insistence that Ukraine must sign a material deal as part of US support adds another layer of complexity to the negotiations, and the deal, originally floated, I think, by France, which would grant US companies extensive access to Ukraine's vast reserves of rare earth minerals, is framed as an economic necessity for Ukraine's post-war recovery, but it's also a practical necessity of showing a presence of US people, while not necessarily boots on the ground. European officials worry that this is little more than an ultimatum: no mineral concessions, no weapons, and that it's not necessarily a deterrent. But it represents a significant shift in US foreign policy, and rather than presenting itself as an indispensable guardian of Ukraine's sovereignty, the Trump administration is treating the war as a transactional affair. The moral imperative of resisting Russian aggression is being replaced by hard-nosed economic leverage. And while some in Kyiv see this as a bitter but necessary compromise, others see it as a first step towards a Western-backed surrender. The suspension of US aid has profound consequences beyond Ukraine. NATO's credibility has been badly shaken. The Trump administration's alignment with Russian rhetoric, its refusal to trigger new arms shipments, and its reluctance to reaffirm America's NATO commitments has left European allies deeply unsettled. But, you have to deal with the reality of what you've got, not the reality of what you wish you had. There's a growing recognition in Europe that relying on the US for security is an increasingly precarious bet, and the European Commission and various national governments, including Germany and Poland, have ramped up their defence production in response. Of course, having Fitzo in your back garden doesn't help. But these measures will take time to bear fruit, and in the interim, Ukraine remains dangerously exposed. If US support continues to erode, Ukraine's position on the battlefield will deteriorate. Russian forces already gaining ground in the Donbass will likely intensify their offensives. exploiting Ukraine's diminished stockpiles of ammunition and air defences. The loss of US support may also embolden Russia to demand even harsher concessions in any peace negotiations. So now is the time, unfortunately. This moment could define the trajectory of European security for decades. If Trump follows through on his hardline stance, Europe will have no choice but to construct a new security architecture, one in which the EU and UK will take a more assertive role. For Macron, this aligns with his long-standing vision of European strategic autonomy. For Starmer, it's an early diplomatic challenge that will test Britain's influence on the global stage. So as Zelensky prepares to go back to Washington, the stakes couldn't be higher. His leadership has been defined by resilience in the face of existential threats, and now he faces perhaps his greatest challenge yet, convincing an increasingly isolationist America that the survival of Ukraine is not just a European concern, but a fundamental test of the post-World War II international order. And whether he can succeed will shape not only the fate of Ukraine, but the stability of Europe itself.